From a meeting of foreign ministers to a full summit involving leaders of the Pacific Islands, South Korea upgrades its push into a region, emerging as the new battleground for superpower influence.
And South Korea plans to host that summit next year, its first ever with Pacific Island nations. It appears to be following the example of ally the United States, which is trying to counter China's growing presence in the region. For more analysis, we're joined by John Delury. He's professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Professor, it's hard to ignore that what South Korea has just announced. We're looking at the Secretary of State hosting the Blue Partner, the partners of the Blue Pacific in 2 days, and President Biden hosting Pacific Island leaders to a summit next week. How much of what South Korea is doing can we see as independent, or is it being done in consultation with, in collaboration with Washington?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, but I think if we read between the lines and even look at recent statements, high-level meetings between U.S. State Department officials and other counterparts, someone like Wendy Sherman, who's doing a lot of the work as the Deputy Secretary in the U.S., meeting with her South Korean counterparts, we've noticed this almost curious insertion of the Pacific and coordinating the approach to the Pacific, not just the Indo-Pacific, which we're all sort of used to now as the grand security concept, but specifically the Pacific Islands. So, on that score, I think we do see coordination and that this is a process of South Korea wanting to work closely with the United States. All that said, this is not coming out of the blue. This is part of a process, a general trend in South Korean foreign policy of becoming much more active in different parts of the world. That's economic. That's cultural, obviously, with K-pop. But to some extent, we're also seeing that in the security side. And so this is quite interesting to see South Korea upping the level and sort of upping its game in a region that it hasn't been hugely involved in. That's a growing center of strategic competition between the United States and China, to see how it navigates this place in the Pacific.
South Korea hardly the only one paying court to the Pacific region. You've got not just the two superpowers, you've seen Australia and New Zealand stepping up since 2018, and again more recently this year after the pandemic imposed a pause. Does South Korea, given that it is relatively speaking a mid-sized power, have strengths relative to, say, the US or China paying courtship to the Pacific Islands?
Well, I think a couple of places where South Korea has kind of comparative advantage is precisely that Korea is new. Korea does not have colonial baggage. There's a lot of complex history with all the countries, the United States, France, Japan, even Australia, for that matter, in terms of the colonial legacies. And South Korea, as it were, is kind of coming in clean. Coming in new. It's not making claims we've always been here, but rather is in a learning mode and coming in fresh and seeing where there's room for cooperation. So I think that's actually a strength that probably from Pacific Island countries, they welcome that approach. And I'd say the second thing is that while South Korea is clearly a U.S. ally, there's sort of no question that when push comes to shove, which team South Korea is on, short of conflict, well, first of all, South Korea does not want conflict, and South Korea tries very hard to avoid the choice. The paradigm here, as in other countries in Asia, is, to not want to have to choose between China and the United States. And so I think actually that paradigm could work quite well in terms of Korea partnering with Pacific Island countries where there's a kind of pragmatism, seriousness about the sustainability and sustainable development, taking all the climate change incredibly seriously, but looking to develop economies, looking for growth. And obviously, Korea still has such a dynamic economy, it can bring a lot. So I do see ways in which, although, we have to keep expectations modest and realistic, Korea could really contribute and bring something a little bit different to the table in a constructive way.
A final question here, Professor. You mentioned sustainability. Now, that's something that Pacific Island nations have been very clear. They've been very skeptical of what's happening with both the U.S. and China. If I quote the Fiji Prime Minister here, he said, geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas. In other words, when you are about to go underwater, who cares about geopolitical competitions? In that context, does South Korea offer something maybe in terms of tech, in terms of scientific research that maybe the Pacific Islands really need over and above geopolitical point scoring?
Yeah, well, that is so well said. And I think there will be skepticism. I would expect skepticism on the part of Pacific Island leaders and publics to everyone who's suddenly showing up, and that would include Korean counterparts. But, to your question, I think one place to look at is in fishing, fisheries. This is an area, shipping. These are areas where Korea is obviously very strong. And already, we've seen some of that type of collaboration. So there's an area to build on there. Tourism, as we exit the depths of the pandemic and return to normalcy, Koreans like to travel. They're looking for new places to travel. We're seeing some increases in Pacific tourism, and, linking that to sustainability is something where I've certainly heard that discussion, again, kind of pre-pandemic, but as we move post-pandemic, sustainable tourism would be another one. So again, I think we do have to be modest in the expectations, but I think there are areas that if the Koreans are serious, and I think the government's serious about this, and Pacific Island leaders want to hear it out, I think the two sides and the many sides could find substantive areas to work together.
Well, thanks very much indeed for joining us, Professor John Delury at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies.